Good day, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the State's Place in the Federal Toxic Chemical Reform webinar. All lines have been placed on a listen-only mode, and the floor will be open for your questions and comments following the presentation. If you would like to submit a question at any time during the webinar, you may use the chat box located on the lower right-hand side of your screen. Simply type your message into the box and click on the send button. If you should require assistance throughout the conference, please press *0 on your telephone keypad to reach a live operator. At this time, it is my pleasure to turn the floor over to your host, Melanie Condon. Ma'am, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you. Hello, everyone. Good afternoon. My name is Melanie Condon. I work for the Natural Resources and Infrastructure Committee here at NCSL. I want to welcome everyone to today's webinar, where we're going to be talking about federal toxic chemical reform and what it means for the states and for industry, the legislatures, and the country. So as a reminder, today is the fourth in the NRI Committee's 2014 Spring Webinar Series. Our next webinar will be held next Thursday, May 29th, also at 3 p.m. Eastern, and it will focus on renewable energy integration. I realize you can't actually click that link up there, but you can find more information on our webinars at ncsl.org. So for today, we've got a great panel that will discuss what toxic chemical reform in the federal sphere means for the states and how it will impact the chemical industry and basically, why it's necessary. So without further ado, I'll introduce our first speaker, Jason Reno, who's joining us from the Environmental Working Group. He represents EWG before Congress and the administration on chemicals policy, including the Toxic Substance Control Act, known as TSCA, as well as on agriculture and other industries. So, Jason?
Thanks very much, Melanie, and thanks to you and NCSL for having me today. I'm Jason Reno. I'm the Director of Government Affairs at Environmental Working Group. Just a little bit about EWG. We were founded in 1993, and we conduct groundbreaking research to move markets and policymakers. We've long advocated for reform of TSCA, the Toxic Substances Control Act. And one of the things we're known for are consumer guides, so that those consumers that want to avoid toxic chemicals, whether through their personal care products, cosmetics, sunscreen, or pesticides through their food, can utilize some of the guides like Skin Deep and our sunscreen guide and our shopper's guide. We also are known for our farm subsidy database, which details all the people that receive farm subsidies around the country, including those that, from where I grew up in New York City, where you might know there's not a ton of farming. So just a little quick history of the Toxic Substances Control Act. It was passed in 1976, signed by President Gerald Ford. It's the only major environmental law never to be updated. And because of numerous problems within the legislation, only a few hundred chemicals have ever been reviewed for safety by the EPA, and only 5 chemicals have been restricted or banned. The law is so weak that in 1991, EPA was unable to ban asbestos, which I think no matter what we think about TSCA reform and the form it takes, I think there's general consensus that we should be banning asbestos. The major flaws really hamstring the agency, and what happened is after 1991, until Lisa Jackson became administrator, it was kind of a forgotten law that the agency didn't really utilize. There is general consensus among all stakeholders that reform is desperately needed. So what are some of the major flaws of TSCA? A weak safety standard. Unreasonable risk is kind of the core of it. It's an undue burden that it's very difficult for the agency to meet. When TSCA was passed in 1976, it grandfathered in as safe and deemed as safe 60,000 chemicals that were already in commerce. And of course, the majority of those have never been reviewed. There's a catch-22 that makes it extremely difficult for EPA to gather data on chemicals or to require it. The least burdensome alternative when it comes to risk management, overly broad allowances for confidential business information and secrecy claims, and insufficient protections for vulnerable populations. Preemption of state and local governments is actually not one of the flaws, and that's why you see states like California and Washington and Maine tackling chemical management on a comprehensive scale, and numerous states across the country tackling chemicals kind of in one-offs and different approaches. So, the weak safety standard. It's unreasonable risk of injury to health or the environment. It's vaguely defined in the statute and is a high burden, and was part of the reason that EPA was unable to ban asbestos in 1990-91. Instead, a strong safety standard is seen as, quote, reasonable certainty of no harm. This is the same standard that's required for pesticides since 1996, and for food additives for about 50 years. So that's kind of seen as the strong standard. As I said, when TSCA was passed, it grandfathered in 60,000 chemicals already in commerce, and they are considered safe with no safety review. There's currently 84,000 chemicals in the TSCA inventory. Nobody thinks there's 84,000 chemicals currently in commerce. One of the issues is EPA has never reset the inventory. EPA Assistant Administrator Jim Jones testified recently that EPA believes there's about 1,000 chemicals in need of review. The issue is twofold. One is that you have these 60,000 chemicals that were grandfathered in, another 20,000 plus, very few of which have been reviewed for safety, and that the current House proposal, through its prioritization process, would effectively great-grandfather many of these 60,000 chemicals that were grandfathered in 1996. And it does that because it says it divides all the chemicals into high and low priority, and the low priority, just by numbers, will be the home of most of the chemicals, and they are unlikely to ever be reviewed for safety. Really, the need for prioritization, we believe, should be focused on whether a chemical is found in people through biomonitoring, and or is persistent, bioaccumulative, and toxic in people and the environment. So the catch-22 when gathering data. We have a system in place where EPA doesn't know what they don't know. Under current law, to get data, EPA must show that the chemical might pose an unreasonable risk. But it's difficult to show that the chemical might pose an unreasonable risk without the data. And so you're very much, agency is kind of left in this vicious circle. The other problem is that for new chemicals, EPA only has 90 days to make this determination before a chemical can go on the market. So on day 91, if EPA hasn't made that determination, the chemical can be on the market. A minimum data set that the companies had to provide to EPA, plus giving EPA test order authority, would help solve that problem of EPA not knowing what they don't know. The least burdensome alternative. So if EPA finds that a chemical violates the safety standard, is unsafe, the next step is to take risk management steps to protect consumers from exposure to the chemical. Unfortunately, under current law, EPA must use the least burdensome alternative, which is basically a cost-benefit analysis. So if the cost of implementing the regulation, whether it be a ban or a restriction, outweighed the benefit, they wouldn't be allowed to implement that rule. And that's the other part of the reason EPA was unable to ban asbestos. From our point of view, risk management should be based on protecting public health. Confidential business information claims. Under current TSCA law, companies are not required to justify CBI claims, confidential business information claims, nor is there a sunset. After a certain number of years, a claim is unclassified. And according to GAO, around 95% of new chemical manufacturing notices contain some information claimed as confidential. This is a huge issue for state regulators that are trying to get information from the agency. It's an issue, can be an issue for first responders and other folks. The other issue is surrounding chemical identity, or the makeup and name of the chemical. It can be claimed confidential even when linked to health and safety data. And what we've heard from researchers and what we've learned is if you're a researcher trying to either replicate or expand on research that's already been done by a chemical manufacturer, and you see that a chemical has been linked to organ problems in rats and you want to do more on that study, but you get the data and the chemical identity has been redacted, instead of spending your time and resources replicating or expanding on the previous research, you're spending your time and resources trying to figure out what the chemical was that has been linked to these health problems. So no sunset provisions, no justification, inability to share with state regulators are all serious problems with current TSCA that we believe need to be fixed in a successful and real reform. Insufficient protections for vulnerable populations. So when we talk about vulnerable populations, we're talking about infants, children, the developing fetus, pregnant women and women of childbearing age, the elderly, and those that are heavily exposed to toxic chemicals, workers and folks that live near the manufacturing plants. So research shows that chemicals are present in the developing fetus, infants, children. Chemicals are present in all of us. The difference is that we all have a better ability to deal with the exposure than infants and children and younger people. So there needs to be extra protection for those folks, especially when you talk about critical windows of development and vulnerability, as well as there needs to be protection for those that are exposed to higher levels of chemicals, including workers and fence line communities. We at EWG, over the past few years, have tested the umbilical cord blood of 20 newborns. And what we found, and this is true of others who have studied the same thing, is chemicals cross the placenta. And so the developing fetus, the most vulnerable point of development, are exposed to toxic chemicals. And that's why we talk about not only should EPA have the authority to take additional steps to protect these vulnerable populations when it comes to risk management, but why we believe that EPA should be required to look at the safety of those chemicals found in people first. Preemption. As I said, preemption is a bright spot in current law. and several states have passed comprehensive chemicals management plans or one-off chemicals restrictions. Minnesota just passed a phase-out of triclosan earlier this week. You know, there's a lot of ways that states co-regulate with the federal government, and we want to make sure that that is protected. Unfortunately, the current proposals in the House and Senate seek to limit states' roles in chemical regulation. What we would deem kind of the most concerning is states being forbidden from future regulation of chemicals that are low priority. This is under the House proposal. If, as I was saying before, it's unlikely or it's likely that the majority of those chemicals classified as low priority under the House proposal would ever be reviewed for safety by the EPA. So it makes no sense from our perspective to ban the states from being able to take action in the future on those. They are, under the current draft, allowed to keep their current regulations, but we think, especially if EPA is never going to look at them, that states who have provided such an important role so far should continue to be able to do so. So states should be able to remain partners and leaders. So just to quickly run down what we believe are some of the solutions needed for reform that fix a lot of the flaws, unfortunately not all of, in current law. The reasonable certainty of no harm safety standard, that is the standard for pesticides and food additives. Minimum data sets, which will save time and money for both the agency and manufacturers. Protection for vulnerable populations, both in risk management and in prioritization. Realistic deadlines and resources. This is another thing that will benefit both consumers, the agency, and manufacturers. If you have realistic deadlines, the agency keeps moving forward on progress and determination of safety of chemicals, and resources will help them do that. Prioritization based on biomonitoring and persistence and bioaccumulation. Risk management based on health, not cost-benefit analyses. Justification and sunsetting of CBI claims, as well as the ability to share information with state regulators and others, and a continued strong role for states to play as co-regulators and leaders on this issue. Thank you. I look forward to taking your questions.
Great. Thanks, Jason. Appreciate your insights. I think it's important that we all can agree that there is some consensus that TSCA does need to be reformed, so we appreciate you going through that for us. So now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, Andy Hackman from Serlin Haley. Andy has years of experience working with industry on toxic chemicals, coming from both the Toy Industry Association and the Consumer Specialty Products Association. And he's been very active in working with Congress to reform TSCA. Andy?
Thank you, Melanie. Appreciate the introduction and appreciate the opportunity to speak to a number of folks, recognize some of the names that are attending today and have been before a number of you, and appreciate the ability to offer perspective here. Jason and I were touching base beforehand, and I'll start off with where we agree, and I'm certainly only offering my personal perspective. I'm not representing any particular client at this webinar, but I have been in the trenches both at the state level and at the federal level on this issue, and I certainly agree with Jason in regard to there is a need urgently for TSCA reform. I think our window and our opportunity is now. Some may not agree with that perspective, and a number of the points that Jason made, I think if we were to sit down over the beer that we had mentioned earlier, we might be able to consider and have some common perspective on, but I won't suggest which one those are at this point in time. Now, moving on to the slide, since joining the lobbying or law/consulting community in January of this year, I am not allowed to give a presentation unless I do a 30-second commercial for who we are. You all can read the slide there. We represent clients before government, primarily businesses, and I'll just go ahead and move on from there. So this slide, I think, is important. Where are we on TSCA reform, and what lanes have we all picked? And I think this is particularly appropriate for those that have been to Washington and sat through our traffic. Are we part of the problem and taking the left lane? Are we part of the solution and taking the center lane? Or are we playing both sides against the other? And I think in terms of the debate right now, there's a lot of those three different perspectives clashing at this point in time, because we still are very much in the thick of things in terms of what is this going to look like if it's going to pass at all this Congress. And I'm hopeful that we all kind of get to a part of the solution center lane perspective at some point, because I do think, to Jason's point, reform is needed. And I think the fact that a number of you out in the states that are listening today have made this a priority for your state legislatures, that it is important from a state's perspective as well. Just a quick update on where we are right now. Jason alluded to, I think, some of the larger dynamics. But in the Senate, we have an actual live vehicle, Senate 1009, the Chemical Safety Improvement Act. It was introduced on May 22nd of last year by the late Senators Lautenberg and the not late Senator Vitter from Louisiana. I can honestly say it was, I think, a pretty surprising and groundbreaking day when the two senators got together around this legislation. We have 25 bipartisan co-sponsors, one of the largest pieces of legislation with bipartisan support in the Senate right now. We did have a hearing on this legislation that says 2014, but it was July 31 of 2013, so last year. It's not a hearing upcoming. And we have ongoing discussions right now in the Senate between Senators Udall and Senator Vitter around what amendments or changes might happen, including working with Senator Boxer's office, who's chair of the Environment and Public Works Committee, to shape where this might be going here in the future. I won't comment on where I think it's going, but just in terms of the current state of play, active live legislation over in the Senate. And in the House, we've had now 7 hearings, I think, if my count is correct, in the last 18 months in the House Energy and Commerce's Energy and Environment Subcommittee. We have a draft of legislation that was released on April 22nd. And as I understand it, late-breaking news is that the potential May 29th markup may not happen next week, but there are discussions around this draft and a potential markup here in the reasonable and foreseeable future here on the House side. So that's kind of where we are in terms of dynamics in the Senate and the House here. I know a number of folks in state legislatures have had questions about, well, really what's going on at the federal level, and you know, is it really going to move forward this Congress or not, and should we ever trust that the feds are actually taking action? I'll just offer that's a snapshot of where we stand right now. Moving down, and this is a gross generalization slide in terms of kind of the major elements, and Jason touched on them in the sense of maybe perhaps of what the flaws are in TSCA, but sort of the core elements of the packages as they exist in both the Senate and the House are around evaluating and updating the safety standard by which chemicals are evaluated. As Jason mentioned, the current TSCA statute has no or unreasonable risk to human health and the environment to prove that EPA should take action. In both of the Senate and House vehicles, it focuses on no unreasonable risk of harm to human health or the environment under intended use conditions for these chemicals that are going to be evaluated as EPA looks to take action. But in both vehicles, House and Senate, there's an update to the safety standard. And then the House and Senate differ a little bit on how their process rolls out from there in terms of looking at safety determinations, safety assessments, and evaluations. The Senate version focuses on doing a safety determination first and then moving into safety assessments, where the current House version looks at determinations and then a risk evaluation as the basis for whether or not additional actions will be taken on chemicals. And both of the vehicles, though, do have a prioritization around what chemical is going to be considered a high priority or a low priority. that's kind of a common element that a number of states have looked at in terms of, as you evaluate broad chemicals policy, we're going to come up with a list of high concern or a list of chemicals of potential concern, and then bucketing some into those areas where we're not potentially going to take action. So the idea of prioritization should be a common theme for folks that have been engaged in this policy for quite some time. Kind of another element that's core and common between the Senate and House versions, and Jason alluded to in terms of how they're going to deal with chemical inventory, data, testing, and reporting. I won't get into the specifics on that because I want to focus a little bit more on the relationship of the potential for both of these proposals to state laws, but they are core elements of updating, reforming how those elements are addressed within EPA's jurisdiction under TSCA reform, and I think are critical elements to getting to some consensus on as these drafts and as both bills potentially move forward. And then another core element to both the House and Senate version is risk management rules to prevent harm from a chemical to human health and the environment. And this is obviously the sort of the critical step of, okay, we've identified a chemical, we believe that there's a strong level of concern, and it's not going to potentially meet the unreasonable risk of harm safety standard. What are we going to do about it? And what specific uses and potential actions are we going to take to mitigate those risks within the structure of a reformed TSCA? And then it's not a four-letter word, but certainly this is where Jason and I may not agree as much as around where preemption attaches, and a little bit farther down in my presentation, you'll see sort of a discussion around preemption and its potential relevance to both the Senate and the House drafts, and I'll offer my perspective on what it will do or where it would potentially impact some of the state requirements and state framework statutes that exist right now. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the role of states as envisioned by some of these statutes to give folks some perspective. Again, as I've been out testifying in some of the state capitals, folks have said, well, what role would the state have if TSCA reform is done, and don't we need to take action now to make sure that we enshrine our ability to protect the citizens here in the following 5 states to specifically move forward and enshrine that protective value here. But let me be clear kind of about the actual ability that a state has under some of these, or particularly under the Senate version, that I want to focus attention on. And I think there's been a little bit of misperception around whether or not the state would still have a role and be fully preempted under the Senate version and the House drafts. But under the CSAI, the Senate version, there is I would call a very specifically active role for the states in helping the EPA make decisions. It's not something where the EPA sits in a golden room here in Washington, makes decisions, and then states don't take action, and they have to react to a mandate that they had no input on and no potential ability to impact. But at the first very basis step, the state will have the ability to submit data, and EPA is required to evaluate that data when they're doing their chemical determinations and assessments under the Senate version. So to the extent states have explored the area of chemicals regulation at the state level, whether it be Maine and some of their prioritizations, or Minnesota and their prioritization efforts, or the state of Washington, which has done extensive use reporting information under their Children's Safe Products Act, that data will be used to inform how the EPA begins to make decisions. And then sort of the second major point is that the states can request that a chemical be prioritized. And under the Senate version, the EPA has to take action on that and respond within 180 days. So there is certainly an ability for a state to say, look, we're really concerned about XYZ chemical here in the state of Vermont or Minnesota, to move forward with a request to the EPA to say, look, we're concerned about this. We think you should take action under Reform TSCA. That certainly has an active and strong role under the Senate draft. And then if the EPA decides on a prioritization that they're going to say a chemical is a low priority or even a high priority for that matter, the state has the ability to request explanations from EPA. Those are publicly available, and it gives the state the sort of ability to review and have impact on whether or not there's a proper justification for action that has been made at the EPA level. And then finally, I think it's particularly important, and it's called out in the Senate version explicitly, there's the ability for a state to request a waiver for local interests and to protect human health and the environment. It's certainly something that's been under a great deal of scrutiny in the Senate, and I think that language is part of the ongoing discussions, but the ability to request a waiver is something that still exists and would be an element of the Senate version. As we look at the House version, this list is a little bit shorter in terms of the role of the states, but I guess the underlying factor is if you look at the Senate draft, which came first, the House version works from a more EPA-driven process and looks more at the states continuing to enforce existing federal statutes with the ability to move in a judicial process for review and challenge, which exists around a lot of statutes that EPA administers right now. It's more of a traditional role for the states, I would argue. It's obviously less of an active role, but I think as these two versions move forward, there's going to be continued discussion around the role of the states. Obviously, it's probably been the biggest issue, I think, in these discussions around concerns from a number of folks is how the states are going to be actively involved, or to the next slide, the four-letter word of the day, and even though it's more than that, is preemption. I do want to sort of provide at least my perspective on where preemption attaches, maybe clear up some inconsistencies or some confusion around when a state would be preempted. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about each of the specific states that have laws in place right now and how they would continue to remain in place in many cases, and how they would relate back to a reformed TSCA at the federal level. And again, looking first at the Senate version, which has probably the most amount of daylight on it since it's been around for a year for review and sort of interpretation and opinion. But it's critical in both versions to realize that the effect of preemption does not happen unless EPA makes a decision on a chemical. Unless they specifically take some action, if there's a chemical that they've done nothing on, a state would not be preempted in any way. So the preemption itself applies when you look at a safety determination. That's the first phase under the Senate bill. It's either a high or a low priority. For those that meet the safety standard, once that decision has been made, so EPA's reviewed data on a class of chemicals, they've made a determination that it meets the safety standard, so that there's no unreasonable risk of harm to the human health and the environment, that's when preemption applies. But they actually have to make a decision on that chemical first. For those that don't meet the safety standard, the preemption effect doesn't apply until the date of regulation. So they've actually taken a risk management decision and said, look, we're concerned about XYZ chemical, and the following applications we put a rule in place to put that risk at bay or to prevent that risk. That's when preemption would apply, again, under the Senate version for those chemicals that don't meet the safety standard. More on preemption under the Senate version because there's mirroring of the House version, but decisions by EPA to designate a substance as a high or low priority will preempt future regulatory action, and I'll get to why that's kind of important later on, but once EPA has reviewed the data and made decisions, it's important that we have the ability to say, okay, we don't have a conflicting standard in place from state to state, and there should be one unifying decision around the data that's made, and EPA is going to be the one that makes that decision. At least that's how it's approached under the Senate version. Existing requirements will continue in force until a safety determination is made. So if there's a restriction on XYZ chemical, that requirement is going to stay in place until EPA has gone through their determinations process. Now, high priority chemicals do get preempted under the Senate version when a safety assessment commences. It's to ensure that there's uniformity around decision making, because EPA has said, look, this is a high priority chemical. We're going to put rules in place that control and mitigate that risk, and we want there to be uniformity around what's done for that. For low priority chemicals, preemption attaches on the date of that determination. So up until that point, there's not preemption, but preemption will apply upon the date of that determination. And then we'll move to the House version, which is largely consistent with the points made before, but there is no retroactive preemption, and Jason alluded to this, for low priority chemicals if they're in place prior to that designation as a low priority chemical. There are some within the industry community that think that doesn't go far enough, so there's certainly some debate and discussion around the House version and around preemption under the current draft of the House version, which has changed over the last about 6 to 8 weeks. Go to the next slide. And here's some perspective on where I think, I don't want to say there's confusion, but in relationship to the soon-to-be 5 major states that have taken action on what I call sort of framework TSCA-like statutes at the state level, we've got Maine leading the way, and I know Senator Saviello is on the phone. Maine went first in this area to fit their state motto. California, Washington State, and Minnesota all have foundational structures around the ability to prioritize chemicals, whether it be in children's products or a broader universe of all consumer products, which is more in the vein of California and to some extent still Maine. These are the states that have laws on the book, these 4, and then Vermont this year has passed legislation that is focused on children's products, but does have a framework nature around prioritizing chemicals, requiring reporting, and it establishes sort of a TSCA-esque structure in Vermont as well, and we expect that law to be signed sometime in the next month or so. But as you look at the framework statutes, if TSCA reform were to pass today, and this is in my humble opinion, but I think folks would back me up on this, if TSCA reform were to pass today in either version of the House or Senate, none of these laws would be automatically preempted. States could continue to move forward in their prioritizations and the development of data around their prioritizations, and particularly under the Senate version, there would be the ability to help the EPA make decisions in a consultative way and at times force EPA into action under the framework statutes that would continue to exist in each of those states. Looking at the individual chemical bans that Jason alluded to, depending upon the chemical, it could be from 25 states on a chemical like BPA to just a couple of states on some other chemicals. But for the states that have moved forward with individual chemical bans or requirements, regulations, those would also remain in place until EPA took some action around a safety determination or a safety assessment. And there's been a lot of discussion even around Prop 65 in California. It's a labeling statute for those that aren't familiar with it, and it's one that has some risk built into it. But again, it wouldn't be preempted unless EPA took a very specific action that countered or was in difference with what had taken place at the state level. And I'm sure folks in the states sometimes don't like the interstate commerce argument or the Commerce Clause, but where's the basis for folks hoping that there would be a uniform national standard around chemical safety? Well, this is really where it comes from. And think of a company that's selling a product that's being distributed or sold nationally. They are asking for the ability to sell that uniformly in all states. And the pure basis of where that comes from is here in the Constitution under Article 1, Section 8, Clause 3, that it's the federal government that's going to help regulate commerce and the ability of goods to flow freely between the states. Obviously, a critical element in our economy, and it's the reason why, and I think there has been such an engagement around this issue at the federal level, is because of the differing state requirements and the need to have some consistency because there's no way that you're going to ever be able to sell a product in one state and tell a retailer that's large and national that they're not able to sell that product in all 50 states. And as I alluded to, the need for that uniformity at the federal level is particularly important, and there is precedent for it when you look at things like the National Traffic and Motor Safety Act, Supreme Court decisions that were made around that, the Consumer Product Safety Improvement Act that was signed into law in 2008, all enshrine some element of having uniform safety standards around things such as chemicals or around things as broad as vehicles. And the necessity of having that uniformity, again, allows a company, allows the ability for commerce to flow, and when you're in an environment of having to compete not just nationally but globally, having that uniformity around a national market is particularly important. And the other, I think, critical aspect from a rationale perspective, as you look at environments from state to state and chemical exposure, particularly in a consumer environment, that's going to be consistent from state to state. So if EPA is actually going to, quote unquote, do its job under this statute and take action, shouldn't the standard be uniform state to state, because they're looking to protect all citizens? And generally, the household environment, which has been the focus of a large amount of the debate around this issue, is going to be largely consistent. A house built in Ohio, a house built in Maine, a house built in California, and the introduction of products or materials that contain chemicals is largely going to be a consistent exposure environment for the large majority of citizens. So that's my arguments for why there's a strong belief that there needs to be some element of strong preemption, and why it wouldn't wipe out all state law as of the date of enactment for TSCA reform. And I'll just end with a quote around innovation and just say that the best way for us to predict the future, I think, is to create it. And I think this is our best opportunity for TSCA reform. I know a number of folks at the state level have expressed concerns around this issue and whether or not TSCA reform should be accomplished in the way it's moving forward right now. I'll suggest that this is one of our best opportunities, and a lot of hard work has gone into this effort, and I am the consummate optimist that perhaps this gets done in this Congress. So.
Great. Thank you, Andy. Appreciate your take and expertise on the subject. So I just want to take a little bit of time and just discuss sort of NCSL's position on TSCA reform. I know a lot of our members have been seeing us in the press lately, sort of coming out against a couple of things that Andy and Jason both mentioned on the House and Senate versions of TSCA reform, and I think it's important just to explain, where NCSL is on this. So NCSL's policy directive on federal regulatory chemical reform is really the driving force behind all of our advocacy on NCSL's TSCA reform. So basically, we believe that TSCA reform at a minimum should, protect states' rights, as I'll get into, and as both Jason and Andy mentioned. We believe that allowing states the right to manage chemicals and to enact and enforce, at the least stricter or stronger chemical policies is essential to any TSCA reform. They've been doing it for decades, and they've been doing it well. So another sort of element that we believe TSCA reform needs to have in it is to act on harmful chemicals first. And so that's, basically saying that the harsher chemicals should be phased out of commerce, and exposure to toxic chemicals that have been extensively studied should be reduced. I think that's pretty cut and dry. We also believe TSCA reform needs to ensure broad access to mandatory safety data on all chemicals. Basically, we believe that chemical manufacturers should bear the burden of proof of safety of their products. And finally, sort of the fourth tenet that we believe TSCA reform needs to have is that it needs to include assessments of chemicals on a standard that particularly takes into account the most vulnerable subpopulations. And Jason did a great job of explaining this. Low-income people, children, pregnant women, the elderly, et cetera. But I would say, first and foremost, obviously the National Conference of State Legislatures, our biggest issue has been the preemption of, state laws that have been enacted to protect their citizens from harmful chemicals. So I've got sort of a map here that we've, recently been doing a lot of research on the states that have chemical laws, and, a lot of states that have multiple chemical laws. We've identified, 72 statutes in 25 states that deal with toxic chemicals, whether it be through labeling, regulating, et cetera. And, Andy talked a bit about this, and I think we agree that, that these laws are vast and cover a lot of different issues. Examples are there's a law in California that prohibits the sale of plastic bottles with the toxic chemical BPA in it. Connecticut and Delaware have similar laws on this. Biomonitoring laws in Maryland that establish programs to detect the concentration of designated chemicals in residents in Maryland. If you go on our website, ncsl.org, we have a full list of the state statutes that have something to do with protecting their citizens from harmful chemicals. And NCSL just believes that states, should have the ability to keep these laws around. And, they've been doing this for decades. In the absence of a workable TSCA, they've been enacting and regulating chemicals to, to help their citizens. They've been, state legislatures have been acting across the board in a variety of, toxic chemicals and regulating issues. And we believe to sort of strip the state legislatures of this ability is wrong and sort of unsafe. So just sort of where NCSL has been in the past year, I know we've really ramped up our outreach on TSCA as, Congress has started to act on it. Beginning in 2013, we sent a letter to the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee that held the TSCA hearing Andy mentioned. We sent letters to the Senate. Most recently, we had Senator Michael Moore from Massachusetts testify on behalf of NCSL in front of the Energy and Commerce Subcommittee, on the harmful preemption language and why NCSL believes that, that it would harm states. On Monday, we sent another letter up that referred to the new draft language from Representative Shimkus. And, to his credit, he has been working it as a discussion draft, and he wants stakeholders to give their input. And so we feel like it finally, at least, we're getting to talk about it, and we're getting to have our position out there and speak with staff. And we've been, pounding the pavement on this issue for, particularly in the past 2 or 3 months. But hopefully, you'll see there the question mark is, NCSL is happy to and would prefer to support TSCA reform that, didn't have state preemption. So I think that's sort of our final road is, getting out there in support of TSCA reform because, it's a nice distinction to be made that NCSL does support TSCA reform. We just obviously are having some issues with the preemption language in both the House and Senate version. But I think that we do want to see something happen, and as we all sort of today on the webinar discussed, we're all sort of hopeful that a TSCA reform can happen. NCSL's position is just that we would want one that obviously didn't preempt states and that could protect both the states and, of course, the American chemistry industry. So with that, I'll just close and I'll open it up to questions. Again, you can type your questions in the chat box. I know we've got one so far. Or you can speak out loud online. So, operator, if you could please begin the question and answer.
Thank you. The floor is now open for questions. If you do have a question, please press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time. Questions will be taken in the order they were received. If you're using a speakerphone, we ask that while posing your question, you pick up your handset to provide favorable sound quality. If at any time your question has been answered from the queue, you can remove yourself by pressing 1. Again, ladies and gentlemen, if you do have a question or a comment, please press *1 on your telephone keypad at this time. Please hold while we poll for questions.
Great. So while we're waiting for questions from the group, I'll just sort of take leeway as a moderator and throw a question out there. To both Jason and Andy, but maybe we'll start with Jason. Why do you think TSCA reform has been so prominent this year and in the past, maybe 18 months? Why do you think this is the time now that it could happen?
I think it's really been building. I've been at EWG for nearly 6 years, and I was hired to. I'll echo Andy. I used to work for Senator Lautenberg, and I think everybody was shocked when that bill was introduced. But I think that there's just been a lot of push among different parties to get something done. There's obviously consumer concern that continues to grow. Certainly all the state action, Melanie, that you talked about has really pushed Congress to get more involved. And on top of that, you have major retailers that are starting to take action. You have Walmart that's requiring the phase out of 10 chemicals. You have Target that is going to start scoring products. Bed Bath & Beyond has talked about a voluntary phase out of certain chemicals. So if you're the chemical industry, you're dealing with a lot of different layers. Plus, if you're a multinational, you're dealing with REACH, Canada, and others. So I think that is really driving, at least from the chemical industry's perspective, their push to get TSCA reform done, and that's really elevated the issue.
Great, thanks. Yeah, Andy?
I largely agree with Jason in terms of this has certainly been building. I've been working in this policy for 13, 14 years now, and the interest level starting at a local level and moving up the chain has been building for at least those 13 or 14 years. I think it is important to note that I think industry has come to the table in this sense, saying, look, we're willing to move forward, and we hear the concerns. We want consumers to have trust and faith in products and the materials that make those products up. And we want to do it right, and we want to do it right once, at least for this country, let alone having to comply with, as Jason alludes to, with REACH, et cetera. And I'll suggest, and this may be a little bit of a tangent from the question, but it's really the small companies that have, I think, helped motivate progress on this issue, because it'll be a small XYZ company that'll call me up and say, my gosh, how do I comply with these 4 or 5 different states? I'm just trying to sell a product that, I invented last year, and how do I do this? Because it has become so complex at the state level to figure and navigate Washington or Maine and California, that I think that pressure and the need to help those smaller companies in a way that says to them, look, here's one thing to shoot for. Let's do the best we can. Let's do it federally. Let's put the resources of the federal government that has extensive expertise, whether or not they've had the ability to act under TSCA, has extensive expertise to make these decisions. I think that's been why industry's at the table, and I think we're all hopeful, but I think that's the disparate sort of requirements certainly has, I think, brought folks to a perspective of we need to do this right at the federal level.
Great, thanks. Operator, are there any questions on the line?
And there appear to be no questions at this time.
Okay, so we have a question in the chat box from Evan Broomfield, who's asking about nanotechnology. And the question is that TSCA as it now stands doesn't specifically address nanotechnology, despite its pertinence to chemical regulation. How can states incorporate concern about this emerging technology into the debate of TSCA reform? I might, Jason, I don't know if I'm not familiar with the argument or sort of debate on nanotechnology in chemical reform. I don't know if you are.
A little bit. I think, it speaks to two things. I think if a state is concerned about nanotechnology, that can be part of some sort of expedited review or prioritization system. But I think it speaks to a larger issue of flexibility in the law for your regulatory agency, especially if we're going to do this once every 40 years or so, which is the pace we're on right now to reform TSCA. you want to take into account emerging science so that you don't have to update the law every time something changes. A similar approach is necessary when you talk about aggregate and cumulative exposures. Everybody is not exposed to one chemical at a time. We're exposed to, on average, Americans are exposed to 100 chemicals a day just from their personal care products, not taking into account kind of consumer chemicals and things like that. So it's the same type of idea. You have to build flexibility into your regulatory system to allow your regulatory bodies to kind of grow and adapt to emerging science. I haven't seen, to my knowledge, Andy may know, specific state legislation that's tackled nano specifically.
There's been a couple, Jay, I don't mean to cut you off, Jason. There's been probably about 6 or 7 years ago, there were attempts to define nanotechnology in California, but in some very specific applications, and that's about as far as I go back in terms of my recollection. I'll suggest that, as you look at the safety standard, nanotechnology would be an element, the intended use, and whether or not a chemical that relies on nanotechnology or a material or a mixture that relies on nanotechnology, and that's a trait of that material or that particle, and I think EPA would have the ability to look at it and say, is there an unreasonable risk of harm to human health or the environment given that it's using nanotechnology? And under the new sort of structure of establishing timelines and a schedule for review of chemicals, I think it's clearly not being addressed at a significant level right now, and a wholesale broad scope under TSCA reform. But I think getting this statute reformed and getting something on the books would allow EPA to take that under consideration under their safety standard is what I would suggest.
Great, thank you. Operator, any last questions?
No, there are no questions in the queue.
All right. Well, hearing no more questions, I'll go ahead and conclude today's webinar on the state's role in federal toxic chemical reform. I'm sorry, I just saw a last question from Senator Saviello, who Andy seems to know well, so we'll let it slide. So Senator says, I realize states want to have the ability to review chemicals. However, a small state like Maine have small staff to deal with these issues. In fact, I believe we were used as a political statement to address certain issues. If there's no preemption, how would stop this effort?
I'll offer a perspective on that. I think that's why there's been an effort to rally around this discussion, is that I'll even take it beyond a state level and cities and towns sometimes taking action on things like phthalates. San Francisco was the first jurisdiction to ever take action on phthalates. So when you have entities, and particularly in a legislative format, the ability to discuss chemicals, complex science, and commit resources to making sound evaluations of a material, whether it be on all uses or very specific uses, it's a challenge. And I take the point and hear it that for states to move in this area, let's do it in a way that I would argue under the Senate version is a collaborative approach that leverages EPA's resources and gives the states a role, so that decisions are made under the best circumstances with the best information. I think it can be challenging when decisions are made quickly under emotional political situations, either in a legislature or even sometimes in a regulatory format. It can be a challenge to have good policy come out of that.
I think, I agree with the senator that, it's an issue for states that don't have the resources, and certainly EPA, even with a gutted budget and continuously decreasing budget, would have more resources and in some cases more expertise. I think that the key is to allow states to continue to play a role, because if the feds are only going to do this once every 4 decades, states can take action to protect their citizens if they're concerned about certain issues. And I think it goes to Andy's point about uniformity, but from a different perspective. Uniformity is great at a federal level. You want absolutely everybody to have the same basic level of protection. But from our point of view, the federal uniformity comes as a floor, not as a ceiling. And certainly everybody should have the same level of protection. And then those states where they have the resources to look at emerging chemicals or emerging science, we believe should continue to have the authority to take action to protect their citizens.
Not to gang up on Andy, but I think NCSL would agree. But we do appreciate all sides of the conversation, obviously, and look forward to, continuing this conversation, working with industry and with the environmental groups as we move forward, and hopefully get something passed eventually. So I'd like to once again thank Andy Hackman from Serlin Haley and Jason Reno from the Environmental Working Group. For those who joined late or who want to listen again, we will be posting this on our website at ncsl.org. And then just a last plug for our webinar series, we'll be holding another one next Thursday, May 29th, also at 3, focusing on renewable energy. For more details, you can see it on our website. Thank you all so much for joining, and we will see you next week.
Thank you, Melanie. We appreciate it.
Thank you. This does conclude today's webinar. We thank you for your participation. You may disconnect your lines at this time and have